I would love to do a podcast or just an episode called Wrong Side of History. Just go through all throughout people throughout history who were just on the wrong side. You know, people who are like, those four guys from Liverpool, they sound like dead cats or whatever. Just everyone who missed the boat. And it feels like maybe Honduras is missing the boat because all these other Latin American countries. I mean, I've traveled a little bit throughout Latin America. I have not been to Honduras, but I'm meeting a lot of people from other Latin American countries, and they're all saying, "Man, I wish we had a Bukele." But then Honduras passes this dumb law basically saying you can't use Bitcoin or something like that, which leads me to believe, and maybe you guys have more information, it just as a guess, there's somebody, central banks within that government paying off politicians or something. That's why they did that. Or they're like, oh my God, we can't let people get financially empowered like they're doing in El Salvador. So we got to shut this down. What is your take on Honduras passing this very bad Bitcoin bill or law or whatever it is?
Well, I'll also point out that President Bukele just in the past 2 days tweeted a link to the a chart showing the homicide rate across Latin America, and El Salvador was at the very bottom, meaning it was the safest, and up at the top, it was either the very top or in the top 3 was Honduras. So Ecuador was higher than Honduras, actually, bizarrely. I mean, Ecuador has fast become very dangerous. But Honduras is a very dangerous place, right? Their homicide rate was something like 51 per 100,000 versus El Salvador's 2.2. And, Max has often pointed out that Bitcoin brings peace, right? I think this kind of goes hand in hand. And you see that in El Salvador, President Bukele announced his policy of economic liberty, and under economic liberty came Bitcoin. And liberty brings, Bitcoin is peace. Bitcoin and economic liberty brought peace. And I think you see that in the results in El Salvador. He brought in the war on gangs after Bitcoin. And now we have a lot of peace. And I think they all go together in terms of the mindset, the low time preference, and just your way of viewing the world and viewing the governance model of the world. And maybe if they adopted Bitcoin in Honduras, they might have a little bit more success like they do in El Salvador.
Well, it's an interesting case study, isn't it? I think that with President Bukele, his secret weapon really are the people of El Salvador. The Salvadorian people are so kind-hearted and beautiful people, and they love the president. The president loves him, and it's a great relationship. And I think that he trusts the people to do the right thing. And by making Bitcoin legal tender, for example, and by passing economic empowerment laws, he's essentially throwing the keys to the people and saying, look, this is your country. And, you see T-shirts all over El Salvador. Finally, it's ours. It's back. We got it back. El Salvador is ours, finally, after not only 50 years, but going back 200 years. So in Honduras, I think, or any country, for the leadership, essentially, at the end of the day, they don't trust people. They don't trust the people. And you see that in the U.S. and you see that in other countries. You see that in Canada playing out spectacularly. The leadership there does not trust the people living in that country to do the sensible thing, to do the common sense thing. So they reach for all the levers of control. They think that we need to insert more control and that we have a problem. The problem is we don't have enough control. And it's a tragedy of being in power, is that you seek more power, and that only exacerbates these problems. So Honduras is taking the opposite course one needs if one wants to do what we're seeing.
And I think it's fiat currency, right? That's the problem for them, is they have their own currency, the lempira, and they can print it. And I think just like what President Bukele spoke before CPAC, the bit about the 2 minutes, 36 seconds about the dollar, I think, an almost sort of gaslighting relationship emerges between the governing class and the governed. So I think they start to use it as a kind of they weaponize it, right? Like, as he was pointed out, they could just print it, but they make you pay taxes. for this illusion, but really it's a kind of submission, right? Like they know, everybody knows it's an illusion. But if you don't pay them, you go to jail for 20 years, sort of thing. I mean, there are huge consequences to this illusion. If you don't believe in this illusion, it's a very totalitarian sort of illusion that they make you believe in. If you don't believe this, you're going to jail. So I think that sort of innate incentive model, the structure, the consensus model of the fiat system creates that sort of, the relationship between the government and the people. So I think El Salvador already had, they were already on the US dollar. So it was easier for them to jump into Bitcoin and to just like go totally, like not even have to trust the Fed. They could just trust Bitcoin, trust the math.
Yeah, I think Stacey's making an excellent point there. And to contrast the two answers, obviously in my case, when you asked me this question, I went on a wild digression without any facts or interesting points. When Stacey's asked this question, she actually pointed out that they have their own currency, the Lempira, and they're printing it, and they're leading to fiat money chaos. I mean, that's the superior answer. So if you're watching this video, you can delete what I said, because what I just said was just like an aside. I just was vacuously filling airtime for no reason and thinking to myself, well, 20 more seconds of this and I'll kick it over to Stacey and hopefully she'll be able to answer this question intelligently, which she did. I had no idea they had their own currency. I didn't know about the Lempira. But God, that makes sense, doesn't it? Doesn't that make sense?
I mean, to quote Michael Saylor, yeah, I mean, the Lempira, imagine if you just bought the Lempira and bought Bitcoin. That makes Honduras, imagine if you bought Bitcoin, is it 10,000 or 20,000?
Michael Saylor's in the New World Order. He won't take over the world. He knows he works in Washington, D.C. He knows the lizard people personally.
Well, the other thing, I mean, these are great points too. And I got to wonder too, I have to believe that why I think it's even more important for if people are watching this in other countries around the world is to create other Bitcoin bubbles, because I feel like there's a lot of Bitcoin bubbles in Guatemala and Costa Rica. And I feel like if those governments try to do what Honduras is doing, I think there'd be way more pushback because they already have some Bitcoin circular economies functioning within their country to where they might be like, no, man, you're not taking this away from us. I don't know. It's just a theory on my part, but it to me, again, I was at the Bitcoin farmers market yesterday and I was talking to some of the people from Bitcoin City in Berlin and what is happening there and how amazing they just went to, for those who aren't aware, Berlin, El Salvador is way in the eastern part of the country. It's very sort of remote. And they just went there. A bunch of Bitcoiners went there for Me Premier Bitcoin and got some El Salvadorians. And they just started a little circular economy now. And there's now like 100 businesses in this little town up in the mountains. And I feel like that's the key to sort of overcoming, it's you got to plant that seed somehow. You can't just wait for like a Bukele to show up in your country. I think you got to start the circular economies where you live, because I even feel like there's a lot of just adopting Bitcoin. There's a lot of people from Mexico, and there's like circular Bitcoin bubbles in Mexico and other Latin American countries. And I feel like it would be harder to impose these laws. I don't know what you guys think of that.
Well, there is one in Honduras, this Roatan.
Right? Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's their own. They're kind of autonomous. They have weird laws there. Well, unique laws, and it's an autonomous region, but it is part of Honduras. It's Roatan, which is a big Bitcoin community. And one other thing I will point out: it's Salvadoran, not El Salvadorian.
Sorry, Salvadorian.
It's okay. And thirdly, I think it doesn't even matter what central governments, central banks, central authorities try to do to stop Bitcoin. They can't stop it. Everything helps Bitcoin. The only thing that they could do is, get on the arc, right? They could start adopting Bitcoin because they're going to have to do it eventually. So President Bukele was the only smart guy in the whole global room of leaders who figured that out first, right? Like by a long shot, because it's now been over 2 years, 2.5 years, where he's been on his own as the singular leader of the head of state who figured it out. All other heads of state will have to follow eventually. The US will probably be last because their fiat currency is, the strongest of the fiat currencies. In a way, that's a blessing and a curse. I think it's a big curse right now that perfect money has come around of Bitcoin, because it's going to make them the last to figure it out.
Yeah, it's the difference between bottoms up and top down. So typically Bitcoin is bottoms up. It's grassroots. It's on the fringe. It's the freaks and the geeks, and they are the first adopters and the cypherpunks. And then it becomes the early adopters, and then it becomes more mainstream, and it's a bottoms up revolution. With President Bukele, it's top down. And that's what made his story so remarkable and unique. And that's why we moved to El Salvador, is that this was a unique story. And it was the cutting edge of Bitcoin at the time. It's like a nation state leader has gone orange pill. And so we got to move there because we got to be part of this phenomenon. And so, but he so far is a one-off. Nobody else has really figured it out to the extent that President Bukele has figured it out. But to everybody's point that they're making, it doesn't matter, because it's the pockets of bottoms up strength all over the world are growing, and they just start to join up together at their own pace. And so we're on the path. It's not, nothing's going to stop this train.
Yeah, and to that point, I want to put this, Max, you tweeted this out about China. I want to put this out there just to prove your point here. Let me share that. This right here. So this is from a Reuters article. Bruised by the stock market, Chinese rush into banned Bitcoin. The global fiat money apocalypse is upon us. The ultimate safe haven, Bitcoin, is going to 500,000. So yeah, this is another example of, like, I guess the point that you're both making, Stacey, of like, yeah, Honduras can do past whatever law they want. It's just delaying the inevitable, because China has tried to ban Bitcoin a bunch of times, and it doesn't work because their citizens are just like, nope. And this article basically confirms that, doesn't it?
Yeah. If they can't stop you in China, and China is, they have social credit scores, they have absolute surveillance of the internet, and perhaps there probably is in the US also, that we have a total surveillance state, but in China, they don't try to hide it or disguise it. They're like, we're freaking watching you, or we're going to crush you if you do anything wrong. In America, they pretend that they're not doing that, and they haven't turned hostile or totalitarian openly like China has. Nevertheless, they're unable, even with that, with a threat of like ripping your organs out and selling them on the equivalent of eBay in China. Like people are still mining Bitcoin. I think they have still something like 10% of the hash is in China, which is remarkable considering that there's such a consequence to Bitcoin mining there. So I think it's not possible to ban it. And I think the US knows that, because a lot of bright people in government and in industry, and at Wall Street have studied it for a very long time. And I'm sure we have a lot of deep experts at, the CIA or NSA, because they would have had to study it, and they know cryptography anyway. So they would have had to study it to see like how to stop it. And they probably determined that it's impossible to stop. So if you can't stop it, then if you can't, first they fight you, right? And then they have to join you.
Yeah, it's like one of those discoveries like fire or the wheel, where once you discover it, there's no undiscovering it. And the vector that it's on is unstoppable. You can't stop fire. You can't stop the wheel, and you can't stop Bitcoin. It's interesting, Graham, that I think it's in 30 countries where Bitcoin's making new all-time highs just this past week. So it's doing incredibly well in Japan, for example. And Japan is a huge economy, and it's a very conservative economy. But, Mrs. Watanabe, who's the prototypical Japanese housewife saver, Japan has a very high savings rate. It's typically the highest savings rate in the world. And they love cash. They dabble in gold occasionally, and they seem to be now veering into Bitcoin. That's a multi-trillion-dollar piece of change that could be now nibbling at Bitcoin.
They're
in a big way.
famous for their forex trading. They love trading currencies in Japan. They were always driving markets, and they were a big player in the whole 2008 crash because there were a lot of forex ruptures happening then between the euro and the yen and the dollar and the yen and the Icelandic krona.
Yeah,
And
our image of the day trader is a teenager in America in the basement, but actually the biggest day traders are Japanese housewives huddled over their terminals, over their screens, and they're massively trading these forex markets. So we are led to believe, and the market seems to suggest that. So the adoption curve amongst these huge pools of capital is becoming more of prevalent. And so that's, again, a huge catalyst on the upside. So the vector, going forward, the path forward is up. And this bull market that we're in now is really in the early innings, to use not a golf metaphor at this time, but a baseball metaphor.
also, I want to say that, this attempt to ban it several times that China's done, or Honduras, it's really a newbie error, right? And many of us, everybody has thought that erroneously, that Bitcoin is a technology, that it's a new technology. And what it is a new money. And money is about collective consciousness and an idea. And you can't kill ideas, basically. So even though it's backed by math and technology, it's not fundamentally a technology, because if it were, these 2.2 million other shitcoins that are trying to compete with Bitcoin on a technology front, number of transactions per second and stuff like that, that's also a fatal error for them, right? Because they're competing. There's no way to compete against Bitcoin because it is money. And it's the only one that will ever be money of the so-called cryptocurrencies or digital currencies, right? There's only one money. And so when these states try to go at these things, at Bitcoin, what they're trying to go at it with is technology, that this is a technology that we can stop. All the other cryptos are technologies that can be stopped. Bitcoin cannot be stopped because it's not a technology, it's money.
Yeah, there's a great kind of thought experiment here. You can only create irreproducibility once.
Yes.
So there's a great Bitcoin philosopher, Knudsen. What's the Swedish guy? Knudsen?
Knudsen. Svanholm. Knut Svanholm.
Knut Svanholm. Okay. And he's written a couple of books, and this is kind of, I think he's the author of this kind of idea where you can only create irreproducibility once, and Bitcoin created irreproducibility when it was hashed, in 2009, January 3rd. Because it's digital irreproducibility, and so you'd only have to do that once, and then you don't need to try to do it again because you can't.
Because it's impossible.
It's impossible to create something that's irreproducible a second time. You can only do that once, and that's what happened. And so it's foolhardy to try to continue to entertain the idea that you will succeed in doing that because it's impossible. And the market shows us now that reality is becoming more accepted.